If you've watched my most recent video about modernizing 18th century underpinnings, I explained how I've strategized my approach to 18th century style pockets and petticoats. I made a white under petticoat with large, built-in 18th century style pockets. For skirts that I make, how I construct them will largely be determined by fiber content and seasonality. If a skirt is going to be made of a cheaper, washable fabric, I will designate it as primarily a spring or summer skirt. And I'll sew it with built-in pockets and more modern closures so that it can be worn as a standalone piece without a petticoat underneath. For any skirt made of more expensive fabrics, such as silk or wool, I will designate it an autumn or winter skirt and sew it with open side slits, saving on the cost of extra fabric for pockets, and requiring myself to wear them over a petticoat. Today I'm going to make 3 new 18th century style skirts. One will be from a white embroidered cotton, one will be from a deep red silk, and one will be from a lightweight wool tartan. Each will be sewn in a slightly different method, so if you follow along you'll get to see 3 different versions of how you could make an 18th century style skirt. I bought the fabric for this skirt from a Facebook destashing group. However, lightweight cotton with eyelet embroidery isn't terribly difficult to find, and you could probably find something similar on Etsy or at Joann's. I've already pre-washed this cotton, ironed it, and ripped along the unembroidered selvage to reduce it to a 27-inch width. I'm going to start with the pockets, so I folded the fabric into quarters to find the center sides. Then I decided not to mark the exact sides, but to move the markings a few inches closer to the front of the skirt. Later on, this will cause some of the bulk of the pleats to shift towards the back. Now I'm going to cut out my pocket pattern, which I drafted directly from Patterns of Fashion 1. I'm cutting a lightweight facing layer out of the leftover cotton from the top edge of the skirt. And I'm cutting a heavier, stronger backing out of a coarse, cheap cotton linen blend I'd like to use up. Then, to set the pockets, I'm placing the facing layer behind the skirt, centering the middle of the pocket with the pin I used to mark the skirt. Then using pins to anchor the position while I make the opening. I'm going to use a ruler and a water-soluble marker to mark an 8.5-inch line down the center of the pocket. And then I'll pin along this line to secure it. Over the sewing machine, I'm sewing along the line, slightly less than 1/4 of an inch from it, then I'll pivot and square out the base of the 8.5-inch line, then I'll sew up the other side, creating a secure line to follow when I sew on the binding. Then I can cut along the line, clipping the corners at the base. To bind the opening, I'm using my favorite bias tape, the 3/4 inch wide lightweight cotton twill tape from Burnley and Trowbridge, which I have finally bought in bulk so I don't have to worry about running out for a while. To bind the opening, I'm just going to wrap this tape around the raw edge and pin it in place. This kind of binding is easy to hand sew without pinning, so I'm just pinning enough to get me started. I'm hand sewing it with a waxed linen thread, feeling as I go to make sure the 2 edges of the twill tape are perfectly lined up. When I finish binding the whole edge, you'll notice that there is a lip around the squared base. To deal with this, I'll simply flatten it and sew around the edges to secure it how I want. Now it's time to back the pockets. I do find it much easier to wait and do this after sewing the opening. I'm going to use an inverted seam, so I'll turn the pocket out through the opening and then line up the edges with the backing piece. Pin it in place and sew along the blue marked edges. Then I'm going to trim down the raw edge, clip around the curves, and turn the pocket back to the inside of the skirt. I'm not going to iron it, I'm just going to finger press these edges flat as I pin them down. Then I can sew around the pocket 1/4 of an inch away from the edge, entrapping the raw selvage. Now that the pockets are done, I'm going to work on the back seam and the closures. I am going to offset these edges a bit so I can try and line up the embroidery pattern better. In hindsight, I probably should have just done this first before marking where to place the pockets, because as you can see, I'm trimming off an unequal amount of fabric, which means that the pleats are slightly uneven on the 2 sides of the skirt. But nobody will ever notice. With my antique machine, I usually don't bother to back tack unless it is in a place that will experience stress, like at the split at the top of the skirt. So to back tack on a machine like this, you just have to plant the needle, raise the foot, and pivot everything 180 degrees around, then you can go backwards a few stitches. Then I can trim the edge down to about 1/2 of an inch. I'll take it to the ironing board and iron the seam open, then fold under the raw edges, ironing them down as I go. Then I'll fell them down, and because this seam will show, I decided to sew it by hand. I used a running stitch, which I know isn't the proper stitch to use here, but I've always loved the look of running stitches. So I'll finish this seam right past the split, all the way up the edge, and then do the other side. Now, I'd usually make a placket to sew along the split, but because everything is white in this project, I think I can get away with just using another piece of that twill tape. I'm going to place it under the opening and then line it up and pin it along one side of the split. Then I will hand stitch it, securing the folded base and felling it up along the seam. And there it is, a very easy placket to set my snaps in when I get to that part. Okay, so I found the center middle of the tape and I found the center of the skirt. And then I found the center side of the tape and then lined it up with the middle of the pockets, which is not actually even because remember I shifted a little bit of the bulk towards the back. So this gappiness here is smaller than the gap here. But anyways, lined those up, and then on the other side, I've already pinned in between, and I just do that by folding the tape in half between two pins, folding the fabric between those same two pins in half, and then lining up the middles, and then you just keep lining up middles and narrowing it down until you get smaller and smaller chunks. I will try to demonstrate that more clearly when I have better lighting. This is what I was able to finish last night. Yay, it's looking like a skirt. And then this morning I'm going to try and finish it up. I have the waistband basted into place, and I need to go and trim it and then fold it over and sew it down real good. And then I just need to do my closures in the back. And yeah, sorry I didn't get footage of actually setting the pleats. I'm going to try and do that with one of the other skirts, but the lighting last night was garbage, especially if you're trying to film white stuff on a dark surface. It just doesn't work well. Now we come to the holy grail of skirts. Outlander costumes are a recurring obsession for me, and having a whole closet of modernized Outlander looks is still my dream autumnal wardrobe. But for whatever reason, the one piece I was most obsessed with is the Mist and Stone skirt, worn recurrently through season 1. I think it's the colors and the magical changeability of the taupe tartan, appearing brown or silvery gray depending on the light and what it's worn with. Hence began the search. I looked through Mood, I checked vintage wools on Etsy, I looked at massively expensive Scottish tartans, and at cheaper flannels and all manner of alternatives, but I found nothing that recaptured the magic of the original. I found a few blogs with decent recreations which cited the source of their fabric as spoonflower, and though I found evidence of several past recreations, none were currently available on the site. I have a lot of experience with spoonflower, and usually when that happens it's because of a copyright claim, so much further down this rabbit hole of research, I found the history of this fabric. This tartan and a few others were designed custom for the Outlander wardrobe department. Apparently there is a tartan registry, so I found the original weavers of the show tartans, but they were long since out of stock of the fabric. I messaged their company and they directed me to a Facebook group. The Facebook group is called Outlander Inspired Costumes, and I did ask the mods for permission before making a video about it. This group is the only source of the actual tartan. They liaison with the copyright holders, and every once in a while, if there are enough orders, they'll do a new weaving of tartan. I've been following the group for about a year and a half, waiting for a Mist and Stone reweave, but so far, whenever it's been on the table, there have never been enough orders to commission the weave. I ordered several yards of the Lost Souls tartan when it was rewoven, and a couple yards when they did a weaving of the tartan from the Isabella Fraser wedding dress. Recently, I ordered a few yards of the Weathered Fraser tartan, which is currently being woven, but no Mist and Stone. But then, someone posted that they had a leftover 1.5 yards of the Mist and Stone tartan to resell. And as I only really needed enough to make a modernized version, I got it. And that is the long, drawn-out version of why this skirt is destined to be my favorite skirt ever, and why I'm terrified to mess it up because I've been looking for this fabric for a year and a half. Anyways, I did ask the mods, and if you're interested in Outlander tartan or any other Outlander costuming, I highly recommend looking up the group. They are a wealth of information, including a more recent post, which I used to figure out how to recreate Claire's pleat pattern. But I'm not gonna lie to you, the tartan is booty expensive. But it is comparable to the cost of any Scottish tartan, and I can assure you it is the most beautiful wool I have ever seen in my life. So that is between you and your sewing budgets. The original skirt Claire wore was reportedly made of 6 yards of tartan. I'm going to be reducing the length and proportionally reducing the circumference, and I also have to squeeze it into 1.5 yards. Comparing the fabric and the direction of the stripes to the original skirt, we can guess that it was not made from panels, but rather from one unbroken length flipped sideways. If I'm going to flip mine sideways to match, that means that I can cut the fabric evenly in half, making up a 3-yard circumference and 30 inches in length, though I will have to sacrifice some of that length to make the waistband, which actually works handily when you pattern match the two sides of the skirt. First, I'm going to pin the sides together, attempting to line them up perfectly. After stitching this, I'll trim the edges down to about 1/2 inch. On both sides of the skirt, I'm going to need to iron it open and fold the edges under. I'll be hand felling these seams, using the needle to catch just 1 or 2 threads of the tartan so that the stitches will be invisible from the outside. When I reached the base of the slits, I did several horizontal stitches across the back tack, further reinforcing it. The next thing I'll do is work on the hem. I like nice thick hems, but for this skirt the fabric is too precious and I don't want to skimp on the length, so I'll keep the hem at only 1 inch. Okay, these pleats were more complicated than usual, but I'm going to explain them the best I can. First, most of my information came from the Facebook group. There was a recent post thread that went deep into how Claire's pleats work. I basically had to feel it out, but I ended up doing a 4-inch pleat in the center front, 3-inch pleats to each side, and 2 3-inch double-layered pleats at the back. The excess was pleated into the 4 tucks at the sides. I wasn't even sure I'd be able to do the same pleat pattern because I'm working with half of the circumference, but they actually do look spot on from the outside. They just aren't as deep. To sew on the pleats, I ran a basting stitch on the machine. I did decide to use the selvage as the edge of the waistband because it would minimize bulk, and the selvage was relatively subtle and my fabric wasn't really wide enough anyways. For the third skirt, I wanted to use a deep red silk, making a skirt like the design from my 18th century capsule wardrobe. I also wanted the skirt to have warm brown undertones so that it would pair well with earthier colors. So I searched for red brown shot silk, and I found this one from Lady Detail on Etsy, which is an absolutely beautiful deep red with just an undertone of brown. But on the other side, it has a shifty, changey red and brown shot look. Both sides were beautiful and potentially useful in outfits, and I couldn't bear to let either side go to waste. So I thought, reversible skirt, that sounds like a fun challenge. To start, I used thread pulling to even up the edges, then I cut two 27-inch panels from the length. I also cut two 1-inch wide strips, which I will use to face the hem later on, and two 2-inch strips, which will be made into the waistband and the belt loops. To sew the side seams, I'm going to use an overlapped seaming method, as I've seen something similar used on historical items, but I'm using it here so that the seams look the same on either side. This will involve ironing over 1/4 inch at all 4 sides, reversing it on the second panel. Before I stitch them together, I'm going to need to finish the edges of the side slits. I cut strips from the selvage edge of the fabric so that I can use the finished edge and avoid another layer folded beneath. I sewed it onto the edge, folding it so that when it folds all the way over, brown will be on brown and red will be on red. I pinned the plackets down and then lined up the 2 sides of the skirt. Lining up the folds was a bit more finicky than I expected, but I'll skip to the solution. I folded the panels over each other and used the ironed edge to line up the seams, raw edge aligned with crease. I pinned them into place like this and basted the seam by hand. Then it was easy to fold the creases back over top of each other, encasing the raw edges on both sides at once. To sew the seam, I used a brown silk thread and stitched with small running stitches all along one edge, and then I flipped it and stitched along the other edge. Then I stitched down the facings, reinforcing the base of the split. I think I'm going to prefer red when I typically wear the skirt, so I'm going to hem it with the edge of the facing in on the brown. I'm going to take those 1-inch wide strips and sew them along the bottom edge of the skirt. There will be 2 sets of belt loops, one in red and one in brown. I'm not going to bother with tube turning, I'm just going to fold them in and top stitch. For the waistband, I also need to prepare 2 opposites. I'm going to measure out the length I need, with enough to overlap, and then mark the ends. I'm going to try making the ends of the waistband into little pointed tabs. I'm also going to place and pin in the belt loops, and stitch all the way around the waistband, except for the part where the skirt will insert. I had people ask me in the last skirt tutorial I made why I didn't explain my pleat math, and I was like, you're supposed to do math? I call this method finding the middles, and it is useful for a lot more than just pleating. You start by taking any 2 points. I usually start with the side and center front or the side and center back. You take those 2 pins and you line them up together, allowing the waistband and the skirt to bubble up. You flatten the bubbles and then use pins to mark where the center fold is on each. Then when you unfold it, you'll see where these centers should line up. So you can just align those 2 pins together and then repin the center folds as one. Now take another pair of pins and repeat the process. And then you keep going until the pins are spaced on the waistband as densely as you want the final pleats to end up being. Once you like the width of the spacing between the pleats, then you can fold over and pin down 1 segment at a time. Basically, never math until you've confirmed that you can find the answer by folding something. Now when I finished the skirt, I've got to be honest, I didn't really like it. The silk just has so much body, it's impossible to get it to drape. Like if I twirl, it just stays in twirled position. I was thinking about sewing some metal washers along the hem to weigh it down, but that was going to be tricky because of the reversible thing. I'd probably have to hide them with silk scraps, but wow, that would have turned into a lot of work. But then Ryan Sews on Instagram commented suggesting sewing a chain inside the hem, which is just fantastic because 1, even weight distribution, and 2, almost no sewing. I'm concerned that it'll make the hem a bit bubbly, but I think that's a minimal downside. And I haven't actually done that yet, and all of my sewing stuff is in storage for the move, so I will have to update you later on how it turns out. So, thanks for watching. If you didn't see my last video, I mentioned that I am currently homeless, or, you know, between houses. I'm getting ready to close on the new house in a few days, and I definitely will have done so by the time I finish this video. As part of the move, I finally set up a PO box for returns for one of my other businesses, and I figured I'd add it to my contact info here. And I'm almost to the 20,000 subscriber mark. What do you want to do when I break it? Ideas are welcome in the comments.